What is this story we've been witnessing? This is God's story, the story of God, the story God shares with humanity. And from our second session through to this one, from the moment we put down the telescope and picked up the microscope, it's been the story of God engaging with the world he made through one particular people. First a family, then a family grown into 12 tribes, now so great and numerous these tribes together form a whole nation. But have you noticed that as we've gone through this story, we've been seeing it with the lens focused particularly clearly on the leaders of the nation, the big authority figures, this people known as Israel. Their original tribal wanderings were told as the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then came Moses, followed by Joshua, and in the last session, a succession of judges, each raised up to free the people from oppression, only for them to fall back into their idolatrous ways each time a judge died. Our portion for this time begins, though, with an unusually domestic scene. A young woman, Hannah, not someone we've seen in the unfolding story so far, nobody of apparently great promise. She's in tears at the temple, weeping and beseeching the Lord for a child. Her husband has 2 wives, the other one already bearing children, whilst Hannah doesn't. And so she implores God to intervene and open her womb. There's some comedy moments. There are some singularly inept men blundering around the scene. But when God does answer Hannah's prayer with a son, 1 Samuel chapter 2 bursts out with Hannah's great hymn of thanksgiving to God. My heart exults in the Lord, she sings. My strength is exalted in my God. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in my victory. She starts out by acknowledging God as the strength of her life, but it's what she says next which helps us dig in, I think, to this next whole chunk of God's story. For having begun with her personal thankfulness, the song then opens up to the broadest horizon. Hannah sings of the Holy One, the Rock who is our God, the incomparable One who is a God of knowledge and who weighs the actions of all, who breaks the bows of the mighty and girds the feeble with strength, who lifts the needy from the ash heap and raises the poor from the dust. For, she declares aloud, the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. One of the wonderful things that Hannah's story does for us as we read our way through all of this is to remind us that this is God's story. It's very easy to get drawn into the drama of Israel, to look at the people and the leaders, their different speeches and their actions, and start to think this is indeed Israel's story. But it isn't. It's God's, even as he interacts with Israel. And that's so important, because if your eyes are fixed so firmly on the individuals involved that you forget it's God at the heart of this, well, then you'll read what comes up now in 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, and 1 and 2 Chronicles, focusing your microscope in the wrong place. You see, here is a big moment. Do you remember where we ended last time? At the bottom of this spiral of apostasy each time a judge dies. So the book of Judges ends with this condemnation. In those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. When there was a judge, a visible leader, all went well. As soon as the judge died, well, this nation fell apart again. So if you're reading this with your microscope trained on the individual people in Israel, you're going to make perfect sense of why now in 1 Samuel chapter 8, the people ask for a king. Because if the problem is that the judges come and go, well, a dynastic monarchy will mean there's always going to be a ruler, won't it? Always someone on the throne. Always be a king to keep you on the straight and narrow. That's good common sense, isn't it? Unless, with Hannah, you've had your eyes turned upwards. Unless you're reading this as God's story with him as the main player. Samuel, the child born to Hannah, has grown up and is now effectively Israel's last judge. He's the one who hears the call from the people to appoint a king, and indeed, having sought the Lord, he does just that. Where Samuel is the last judge of Israel, Saul becomes Israel's first king. The management structure has now shifted. The people have what they've asked for. But in 1 Samuel chapter 12, as Samuel gives his final address to the people of Israel, he makes two things very clear. Things we'll only understand when we remember this is really God's story. First, he reminds them that God's plan A is God's plan A. The people of Israel are still to hear the voice of God, to live by his commandments, all the language we're used to from Torah, from Moses' charge to them back in Deuteronomy. If you will fear the Lord and serve him and heed his voice and not rebel against the commandments of the Lord, it will be well. Chapter 12, verse 14. Just because there's now a king, they still need to live the clear, holy, faithful, worshipping life they were called out of Egypt to live. But second, now their future is firmly bound up with their king. Pointing at Saul, Samuel declares, "See, here is the king whom you have chosen, for whom you have asked. See, the Lord has set a king over you. If both you and the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God, it will be well." Samuel will go on to make it clear that they've made a mistake in asking for a king. He'll call that a great wickedness. Because the thing Israel was supposed to do was to live out, to demonstrate, to be Yahweh to the surrounding world. All the surrounding nations had a king. They were supposed to stand out by Yahweh being their king. He has a throne in the tabernacle. His presence is at the heart of their national life. They shouldn't need an earthly king. Being a holy and worshipping people, according to all God's commands, would demonstrate to the world around them how perfect a king Yahweh is. It's a great wickedness that they've demanded a king like the nations. So Samuel shows them they must still live according to God's holy law. But now their ability to do that will be entirely bound up with whether or not their king does the same. And that question, will this king follow the Lord? Or will he turn to the right or the left? Well, at the broadest level, that's the story of the rest of the Old Testament. Saul is king over all Israel. He's tall, he's handsome, he's chosen by God, he's anointed by Samuel, and initially he's a great success. He unites the nation and wins an early military victory over the Ammonites. But very soon, Saul takes the idea into his head that as king, he is in charge. Hannah's lifted our eyes and reminded us he isn't. The pillars of the earth, after all, are the Lord's. He's in control. But on the verge of a fight with the Philistines, when Samuel isn't where Saul needs him to be, Saul decides to make a sacrifice to God by himself. Now, sacrifices are only supposed to be done in one place, in Shiloh, and they're supposed to be done by a priest. Here, though, because he's fearful his own people are getting restless, the king, not the priest, makes a sacrifice in Gilgal, not Shiloh. That mightn't sound like very much, but what was the instruction? Do not turn aside from these commands to the right or to the left. In one action, Saul's done the unthinkable. In a moment of crisis, instead of turning the people towards the Lord, Saul has pressed God into his own service. He's made an unlawful, inappropriate sacrifice in the hope that simply invoking the name of God will settle the people down. Saul was supposed to lead the people in following Yahweh. Instead, he's used Yahweh's name to impose his own earthly power upon the nation. In the context of Hannah's reminding us that the mighty will be brought down, the king then does experience the reality of that promise, as God rejects Saul and anoints a young shepherd boy, David, instead. Of course, David rises to prominence because he, a lowly boy, succeeds where Saul's massed armies have failed and defeats the greatest of all the Philistines, Goliath. But the rest of 1 Samuel then becomes the story of a striving between Saul, rejected by God, yet still on the earthly throne, and David, now anointed as his successor. Saul initially welcomes David to the court, then pursues him and seeks his life. David has a couple of opportunities to kill Saul, but restrains his hand, and so we witness Saul's continuing to decline, to the point of seeking guidance and direction, not from the Lord, the one who's spoken and clearly articulated life, but even from a medium shortly before his death at the end of the book. It's a salutary lesson. For the individual, Saul is only effective as a king for as long as he is faithful to God. But it's a lesson for the nation too. Their request for a king will only help them as long as the king is faithful to their true ruler, Yahweh himself. David gives us a better picture. After Saul's death and some brief internal wranglings, David is made king over all Israel in 2 Samuel chapter 5. He brings the Ark of the Covenant. Do you recall that most holy of items from the tabernacle? It's travelled with them through the desert, through the wilderness, and into the capital city itself. And he seeks to build a temple, a permanent bricks and mortar version of the tabernacle tent, a lasting seat of Yahweh in the midst of his people. God says no to that building project. That's for a future time, he says. But in the process establishes his own covenant promise with David. And this, in 2 Samuel 7, is one of the most wonderful descriptions of the kind of king God's people truly need. David is the one chosen by God, brought from the lowly place of the shepherds to the mighty seat of the Prince of all Israel. The one who's been accompanied on every step of his life's journey by God himself. One who will, because of that, have a great name, a people at peace, rest from their enemies, and, critically, this David will have a son, one who will come from his line and whose throne God will establish forever. Just as the people in the time of the judges cried out for a dynastic monarchy, for a line of kings to end the ups and downs of leaders coming and going. Now God promises even more, a single perfect king whose reign will be everlasting. David's reign will then be shown to be effective, to be compassionate. We'll see David as a flawed man, certainly, most especially in his taking of Bathsheba, another man's wife, though even when he does sin, he also learns to repent and turn back to the Lord. In David, we have a glimpse of the ideal king, the promise of the perfect king. Then his son Solomon seems even better. Solomon chooses wisdom as the gift he most desires from God. That's a great sign of an ideal king, isn't it? And his reign certainly becomes great. By 1 Kings 5, he is building the temple David had thought of. And when he dedicates it, God's presence comes upon it and into it in a hugely powerful way. In fact, 1 Kings 10 is probably the very highest point in the whole of the story of Israel. A great people gathered around their God at the temple in Jerusalem, the capital of the land they were given to inhabit. The nations, in 1 Kings 10, it's the Queen of Sheba streaming in to see and witness this great blessing of the Lord. This is that first promise of Abraham, now known and lived out in glorious technicolor, isn't it? The foreign queen declaring, "Blessed be Yahweh your God, who was delighted in you and set on you the throne of Israel. Because Yahweh loved Israel forever, he has made you king to execute justice and righteousness." Here is the people experiencing the promise of God and fulfilling their missionary calling to bear witness to him in all the world. A holy people led by their king, worshipping their God, and all the world being blessed. But maybe by now you're conditioned to expect a but, are you? In the very next chapter, after all that greatness, we discover even Solomon has been turning aside to the right and the left. In fact, specifically having his head turned to either side by many foreign women. Rather than a chaste king protecting the purity of Israel, here is a man who's even taken the Pharaoh's daughter to be his wife. What? The Pharaoh's daughter? That's Egypt. That's the place of slavery God redeemed this people from. That's the place of all places Israel shouldn't be turning to. Yet Solomon's marrying into Egypt's dynasty. Well, now we enter a familiar spiral. After Solomon's death, there's a wrestling over the line of succession, and eventually the kingdom splits. What has been one nation, Israel, all 12 tribes named for the sons of Jacob, now becomes two nations. In the north, 10 tribes. That'll continue to be called Israel, sometimes Samaria. In the south, including Jerusalem, just 2 tribes, now called Judah. 2 kingdoms, 2 kings. And we know enough, don't we, to know all will depend on who and how these kings are. But the first king of the separated northern kingdom chooses his path very early on. You see, the temple isn't in his territory. And the thing about the temple is that the temple is where you go to worship God, because that's where God dwells physically on earth. So for fear of his people defecting, travelling to Jerusalem and not coming back, Jeroboam, the first king of the northern kingdom, sets up 2 new places of worship, one in the far north and one on the southern border. From all we know, that's plainly wrong, but just in case we're not quite grasping how awful this action is, Jeroboam sets up a statue of a golden calf at each shrine and lets the people bow down before them. Now, we jumped over that detail when we thought about the Israelites wandering in the desert in Exodus following their rescue from Egypt. But you may well know one of the lowest points on that particular journey was that they fashioned calves of gold and worshipped them in place of Yahweh. So Jeroboam here is doing something so plainly wrong, so evidently evil, and we know this not just in theory but from the practice of their history. So sinful and wicked that this will now become a byword for faithfulness. From this point on, each time the book of Kings or Chronicles tells us of another king, of a new ruler, we're looking to learn whether this particular king will follow in the footsteps of his forefather David, the ideal king, or turn aside to the ways of his forefather Jeroboam. There's a few notable exceptions, but as in the time of Judges, we witness a litany of unrighteousness as these 2 divided nations spin downwards, and it sometimes feels inexorably away from their God. Now, this is largely where the narrative of the Old Testament ends. There's more to say, and we've 2 more sessions before we reach the New Testament. But the situation of God's people is the product of this time, eventually following the leadership of some of Israel's most egregiously apostate kings. The northern kingdom will be defeated by Assyria, the people carried off into exile, and they will never return. 10 tribes gone forever. The south fares slightly better, but it too eventually succumbs to a foreign power, this time not Assyria but Babylon. They spend 70 years in exile in Babylon, but do eventually get to return. When they come home, though, they find the land, the city, above all, the temple, destroyed. So the books of Ezra and Nehemiah will tell us the story of that return and the rebuilding. It's not a pretty picture at all, is it? And yet there is something we cannot let go of. Just as Hannah lifted our eyes at the outset to God, so we have to finish there. Because there is this promise of God. His promise first to Abraham, a great people, a wonderful land, blessing the world. A promise strengthened by the covenant now with David, the ideal, perfect, everlasting king, the permanent peace, that king, that prince of peace, we might even call him. The peace, the rest, the shalom he will bring upon all of God's people. This is God's story, and that's God's promise. It's not a promise which depends on the weak and fallible flesh of a mere Israelite leader. It is a promise which is supposed to call out in God's people and not turning to the right or the left from the word of God's commands. But ultimately, it's a promise which is grounded in, based upon, born out of God's unending faithfulness to his powerful and effective word for his people. And it's that tension, the tension between the utterly faithful God and his constantly unfaithful people, to which we'll turn from a different angle in our next session.